Let's talk about revitalizing our mix for our potted plants in our GreenStalk vertical gardens.
Guten Yardening, everybody. Well, it's not exactly ideal conditions out here for being in the garden. There's rain and there's supposed to be 30 to 40 mile an hour gusts of winds, but I've got lots of work to do, and as much as the rain is hindering me from doing this work now, I know it's bringing a lot more benefit as we go through this season because we definitely need it. And so today I want to talk to you about some of the options you have or degrees to which you can go to for soil rejuvenation.
Now, before I get into the process of revitalizing the mix that's in here, there are a couple of things that we have to consider. The first thing is, did our plants have any kind of disease this past season? Because one of the things we try to do is avoid immediately reusing the soil from diseased plants. So one of the things we try to do instead is to put that soil mix into our compost. And that's going to heat up enough, and over time it's going to kill off any of the disease. One of the things to remember is that powdery mildew, for example, can survive in the soil, can survive over winter, even though you won't have as much of it likely. And so we don't want to reintroduce that to our plants that are starting brand new. Another thing to remember is that some common garden pests overwinter well as well. So if you struggle with squash vine borer, if you struggle with aphids, for example, well, that's another example of where you might want to take your mix, throw it in the compost instead of trying to reuse it right away, because it's going to be really hard to get in there and pick everything out. Now, of course, no matter what you do, you're going to have the possibility of these being reintroduced anyway, but it's just a precaution we like to take. Before we get into the revitalization process, typically it's important to do a pH and an NPK test. If you haven't done that recently, you're going to want to know what the levels are in your soil, especially depending on what you're planning to grow the next season. For example, if you've grown something the previous season that feeds really heavily on nitrogen and phosphorus in one of your setups, well, you might need to add that more heavily than the potassium. And that's something that you have to keep in mind as you're going through this. And one of the benefits of container gardening that we've talked about in previous videos is you can definitely set each of these up to be exactly what you want them to be. But doing a pH test or an NPK test is a simple process. It doesn't take a lot of time to do, and it's best to know what you have in your medium before you start adding different ingredients. Now I'm going to start out with this container which we had tomatoes in last season, so I can talk a little bit about the degree to which I want to revitalize this, or I need to, and also some of the first steps in what I'm doing. The first thing I want to do is to empty this plant out. Now I could have pulled these out from the top for sure, but I want to go in here and I want to see if there are any bigger roots, because I want to get those removed first, and then we'll take a look at what we have for our mix. Now my plan is not to do one container at a time. That would take way too long, and quite frankly, I've got so many of these I couldn't possibly do that. But for this example, I think it just makes sense to take a look and see what we have here and talk about what we need. So this had tomatoes, and tomatoes are pretty heavy feeders. They're pretty heavy NPK feeders all around. Depending on your needs, you have some options here. If you're just looking for some quick revitalization, then one of the things you might consider adding is some worm castings. Now, these worm castings have gotten pretty wet out here in the time that I've been recording this video, but I left some of my worms in here because I actually like adding worms into our containers, and we have plenty of worms in our worm compost setup indoors that bringing some of these out here to add is not a problem at all. And they're going to continue doing their job once they're out in these containers. So adding worm compost or worm tea is a simple way to really improve your soil. It does a couple of things. It improves your soil tilth. Now, while adding this isn't going to drastically improve your soil's NPK, because that's really not the purpose, it is going to add some incredible microorganisms that are going to make a big difference in the health of your soil and your plant's abilities to take in nutrients as well. So this is a simple step if you're just looking for a quick revitalization of your soil. Now, a secondary option is quite simple as well, and that's going 50-50 with some brand new potting mix and adding it to your old. Now, this is going to be a step farther for sure, and it's also going to be a little bit more expensive, but it is an option that you have, especially if you've struggled a lot growing in whatever mix you've been using. Now, the third option, which is going to go even farther than the first two, is to get some of this organic compost, and that's Purple Cow organic compost, whatever you have available in your area, or perhaps you're creating your own compost, but taking 2/3 of your potting mix and adding 1/3 of that organic compost. Similar to worm castings, compost is incredible when it comes to adding that great organic matter and life back to your soil. And it also helps with the nitrogen levels. Even though this really doesn't deal with the NPK, you are bringing some amazing health back to your soil. Now remember, revitalize. Re means again, vita means life. It means to bring life back to the soil. We're looking at creating the best living soil that we could possibly have for our plants. I want to bring some of this up really close so you can see the makeup of this mix, because we've created this mix, and that's why you see the pieces of perlite and vermiculite in here. You see that it's nice, loose, light mix, because that's what we like to grow in. If you've never created your own mix before, if you have massively heavy feeding plants, or if you're just buying from the store, it's highly possible you may need to do a full revitalization. And that full revitalization could include ingredients like perlite or vermiculite, which are fantastic for adding the ability to hold on to moisture, so moisture retention, and also the ability for air to be in the soil. You don't want that heavy, compacted soil for growing most of the vegetables that we have. You may also find that you need to add ingredients like cocoa cure or peat moss. They're a great addition to the soil matrix that you're trying to create. Again, our goal typically is to create a nice, light soil that holds moisture well and that the plants have ease of access in getting to those nutrients. And so a full revitalization may take a little bit more time, may again be a little bit more costly because you're adding more ingredients, but the end result, especially if you've struggled growing in containers, could be a huge difference maker for you. Now, I talked a little bit early on about doing the NPK testing, and I truly think that's super important, because otherwise you're going to be adding excess nutrients where they're not needed. And quite frankly, adding too much fertilizer is just as harmful as, maybe even more so, as not having enough. You can have the exact opposite effect of what you're trying to create. But typically what we do for our plants is to add an all-purpose organic fertilizer. This is a all-purpose 4-4-4 mix, so we've got an even amount of NPK. And if we have something that we know is going to feed heavily on the nitrogen, what we do is we add our blood meal. Blood meal does a great job with this. It provides a great source of nitrogen if we're growing, for example, leafy greens. We add our bone meal to our plants that we're planning to grow that need a lot of phosphorus. And we also add langbionite to our plants that we know need a lot of potassium. So basically, with those three ingredients, with our blood meal, our bone meal, and our langbionite, we can hit in on the specific N, P, or K that our plants need, so we can be precise in what we're adding. Now, on top of those, there are a couple of other ingredients we like to add to most of our container gardens. One of them is powdered azomite, which is a combination of trace minerals. I don't think you can go wrong adding those minerals to the soil. Remember, what's in the soil goes into the plants, and those plants become healthier and provide more nutritional value to you when they're growing in healthier soil. And the second thing that we like to add is mycos mycorrhizal, especially to our root crops. But mycorrhizal helps the root development of our plants, and that makes a big difference in our container gardens when it comes to plant root health. What you need to remember, and this is super important, there are directions on the bags of those fertilizers for a reason. What we never recommend you do is just picking some fertilizer out and dumping it on and hoping for the best. Again, those directions are there for a reason. You want to make sure you're getting the appropriate amount of fertilizer for the volume of your mix. Well, I've got a lot of work ahead of me. I've got multiple green stalks to do, just what I did with you today. We've got to revitalize the soil. So I'm going to get all these dumped into a nice pile, and we're going to get to work. Well, you enjoy the rest of your day today. Hopefully, you're out in your garden, you're enjoying yourself. If you enjoyed today's video and found it useful, don't forget to give us a like. Leave us a comment, remember to share and subscribe, and most importantly, remember, when you're with us, you are good to grow.